In 1965, Shirley Muldowney sat in the bleachers at a drag strip in upstate New York, watching her husband race a beat-up Corvette down the quarter mile. She was 25 years old, a mother, a former street racer from Schenectady who had been running illegal races since she was 16. And as she watched her husband struggle to keep that car straight, something clicked. She could do this. She could do this better. What followed was one of the most improbable careers in motorsport history. A woman who would become the first person, male or female, to win 3 NHRA Top Fuel championships. A driver who would fundamentally change how the racing world thought about the 426 Hemi engine. Along the way, we'll encounter blown engines, shattered barriers, near-fatal crashes, and a rivalry that defined an era. So, let's begin. But first, what exactly was drag racing in the 1960s, and why was it such a hostile place for women? Now, to understand what Shirley Muldowney accomplished, you need to understand the world she was trying to break into. Drag racing in the mid-1960s wasn't just male-dominated. It was aggressively, almost violently male. The pits smelled like nitromethane and testosterone in roughly equal measure. Women were allowed at the track, sure, as girlfriends, as wives, as trophy presenters in tight shorts. But drivers? Competitors? That was considered somewhere between absurd and offensive. The NHRA, the National Hot Rod Association, had rules about this. Not official rules, mind you, nothing written down, but everyone knew. When a woman applied for a competition license, she was quietly directed toward the powder puff divisions, exhibition runs, novelty acts, the real racing, the fast racing, the dangerous racing. That was for men. I mention this because Shirley Muldowney didn't care about any of it. She had been racing since she was a teenager, borrowing cars, outrunning boys on back roads outside Schenectady. By the time she married Jack Muldowney, a drag racer himself, she already knew she was faster than most of the men at the local strips. The problem was getting anyone to take her seriously. Her first official NHRA license came in 1965. It took her 3 attempts. The first 2 times she was rejected without explanation. The third time she showed up with her husband, her racing results, and what she later described as an attitude that suggested she wasn't leaving until someone signed that piece of paper. They signed it, grudgingly. But here's the thing about getting a license. It doesn't mean anyone has to let you race. Track owners could refuse entry. Other drivers could refuse to run against you. And the fans? The fans in the mid-60s weren't exactly progressive. Shirley Muldowney's early career was defined as much by the people trying to stop her as by the racing itself. She started in Superstock, driving a 1965 Dodge Coronet with a 426 wedge motor. Respectable power, nothing crazy. She won races, local stuff at first, then regional events. By 1966, she had caught the attention of the national circuit. And that's when the real resistance started. See, winning a few races was one thing. Being genuinely competitive was another. When Shirley started showing up at major events and actually threatening to win, the harassment intensified. Mechanics would refuse to work on her car. Other drivers would make comments in the staging lanes. One famous incident involved a competitor who told her, to her face, that she should go home and cook dinner. Her response is not printable here, but it involved a suggestion about where he could put his crankshaft. By 1969, Shirley Muldowney had moved up to funny car. This was serious racing now. Nitromethane fuel, fiberglass bodies that could peel off in a crash, speeds approaching 200 miles per hour in the quarter mile. And at the heart of these machines was an engine that would define her career, the 426 Hemi. The 426 Hemi wasn't just an engine, it was a statement. Chrysler had developed it in the early 1960s specifically for racing, and by the time Muldowney got her hands on one, it had already become legendary. The hemispherical combustion chambers, the massive valves, the sheer displacement. On paper, it was the perfect drag racing engine. In practice, it was temperamental, expensive, and prone to spectacular failures when pushed too hard. And Shirley Muldowney pushed it too hard, constantly. That was her approach. Find the limit, go past it, figure out why the engine broke, fix it, try again. Most racers treated engine failure as bad luck. Muldowney treated it as data. Her crew chief in those early funny car days was Connie Kalita, who would later become one of the most successful team owners in NHRA history. But in 1969, he was just a fast driver with fast cars who saw something in Shirley that other people missed. She wasn't just brave, she was analytical. She wanted to understand why things broke. Most drivers wanted to go fast and let the mechanics worry about the rest. Muldowney wanted to go fast and know exactly why she was going fast. This becomes important later. Remember that. The funny car years were brutal. Between 1969 and 1973, Shirley Muldowney survived 4 major engine explosions, 2 fires, and 1 crash that put her in the hospital for weeks. Each time, she came back. And each time, she learned something. The engine that exploded because the fuel system ran lean? She redesigned the fuel delivery. The transmission that shattered because the clutch engagement was too aggressive? She modified the clutch pack. The thing is, nobody was teaching her this stuff. There was no manual for how to make a 426 Hemi survive 8,000 RPM passes on nitromethane. Every team was figuring it out on their own, and most of them were protective of what they learned. But Muldowney had an advantage that nobody expected. She was an outsider. The men wouldn't share information with each other because they were competitors, but they would sometimes talk in front of her because they didn't consider her a real threat. Mistake. By 1973, Shirley Muldowney had compiled enough knowledge about the 426 Hemi to write a textbook. She knew which rod bolts failed first. She knew how the main caps flexed under load. She knew the optimal port geometry for nitromethane combustion. And she had developed a series of modifications that nobody else was using. The first modification was to the cylinder heads. The stock Hemi heads flowed well, but the valve guides tended to wear unevenly under racing conditions. Muldowney worked with a machinist to develop bronze valve guides with tighter tolerances. The result was more consistent valve operation and fewer catastrophic valve failures. The second modification was to the connecting rods. The factory rods were strong, but they had a tendency to stretch at high RPM, causing the pistons to contact the heads. Muldowney switched to aftermarket rods made from a different aluminum alloy, lighter and stronger than the originals. This allowed higher RPM without rod failure. The third modification, and this was the one that really mattered, was to the crankshaft. The factory Hemi crank was a cast piece, adequate for street use but marginal for racing. Most teams were using forged cranks from specialty manufacturers, but these cranks were designed for endurance, not peak power. Muldowney worked with a crankshaft specialist to develop a crank with counterweights optimized specifically for quarter-mile acceleration. The crank was slightly heavier than the racing norm, which conventional wisdom said would hurt performance. But Muldowney had figured out something that conventional wisdom missed. In a drag race, you're not trying to rev the engine as fast as possible. You're trying to put power to the ground as efficiently as possible. A heavier crank stored more rotational energy, which smoothed out the power pulses and reduced wheel spin. The engine felt less violent, but was actually faster. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't.
And Shirley Muldowney pulls a big lead off the starting line, and she is never to be headed as the engine goes away in Lucille Lee, and Shirley Muldowney wins her 4th Spring Nationals title.
577 for Shirley Muldowney. Did she like that or what?
We do this every week. All right, here's where it gets interesting. In 1974, Shirley Muldowney made a decision that shocked the drag racing world. She left funny car. the class she had spent 5 years mastering, the car she had nearly died in multiple times. Gone. She was moving to Top Fuel. Top Fuel dragsters were, and still are, the fastest accelerating vehicles on the planet. They produce somewhere between 8,000 and 11,000 horsepower, depending on who you ask and how you measure. They cover the quarter mile in less than 4 seconds. And in 1974, they were basically controlled explosions with wheels. Nobody thought Shirley Muldowney could handle a Top Fuel car. The physical demands were extreme. The G-forces during acceleration could cause blackouts. The superchargers sat directly in front of the driver's face, and when they exploded, which they did regularly, the results were often fatal. But Muldowney had spent years studying the 426 Hemi. She knew that engine better than almost anyone. And Top Fuel cars used the same basic engine architecture, just blown up to absurd power levels. All those lessons from Funny Car, they applied here too. Her first Top Fuel season was rough. DNFs, engine failures, one horrifying moment when the car went sideways at 180 miles per hour, and she somehow kept it off the wall. But she was learning, always learning. By 1976, she had it figured out. That year, she became the first woman to break the 5-second barrier in a Top Fuel dragster. 5 seconds. From a standstill to over 250 miles per hour in 5 seconds. The NHRA establishment didn't know what to do with her. She was undeniably fast. She was winning races. But she was also a woman, which created what we might politely call discomfort among certain segments of the fan base and competitor pool. The men she raced against fell into 3 categories. Some respected her. Don Garlits, the legendary Big Daddy, always treated her as an equal. He said publicly that she was one of the best drivers he had ever competed against. Some tolerated her. They wouldn't trash talk her in public, but they wouldn't defend her either. And some actively tried to force her out of the sport. They filed protests over minor technical violations. They complained to track officials. They spread rumors. None of it worked. Shirley Muldowney kept winning. In 1977, she won the NHRA Top Fuel Championship, the first woman to win any NHRA professional championship. Let that sink in. Drag racing had existed as an organized sport for over 20 years. Thousands of competitors, hundreds of champions, all of them men, until Shirley Muldowney. The championship wasn't a fluke. She won it again in 1980, and again in 1982. 3 Top Fuel championships, still the only woman to ever win one. And the engine modifications she had developed, they became standard throughout the sport. The bronze valve guides, the optimized crankshaft counterweights, the specific connecting rod specifications. By the early 1980s, everyone was using them. Most of them didn't know where the innovations came from. But her success came at a cost. In 1984, Shirley Muldowney was racing at the Grand Nationals in Montreal when her dragster suffered a catastrophic tire failure at over 250 miles per hour. The car went airborne, flipped multiple times, and disintegrated across the track surface. She survived, barely. Both legs were shattered. Her pelvis was broken. The doctors told her she might never walk again. She was back in a race car 18 months later. Think about that. 18 months after an accident that should have killed her, that did nearly kill her, that left her body held together with pins and plates and sheer determination, Shirley Muldowney strapped herself back into a Top Fuel dragster and went racing. The comeback years weren't as successful in terms of championships. Her body had limitations now. The injuries never fully healed. She couldn't drive as many races per season, couldn't sustain the relentless schedule of her peak years. But she kept competing into the 1990s, still occasionally winning rounds against drivers half her age. Now I should talk about the engineering legacy, because that's really what sets Shirley Muldowney apart from other pioneering figures in motorsport. A lot of barrier-breaking athletes are remembered for being first. First woman to do this, first person to do that. Muldowney was certainly that. But she was also an innovator whose technical contributions improved the entire sport. The 426 Hemi modifications I mentioned earlier were just the beginning. Throughout her career, she developed improvements to fuel system design, clutch management, and chassis setup that became industry standards. Her approach was always the same: observe a problem, analyze the failure mode, develop a solution, test it until it worked. This methodology was unusual in drag racing, which had traditionally been more art than science. Most successful racers relied on feel, on intuition, on doing what worked without necessarily understanding why it worked. Muldowney wanted to understand why, and that understanding gave her an edge that pure driving talent couldn't match. One particularly interesting example involved clutch management. In a Top Fuel dragster, the clutch doesn't work like a normal car clutch. You don't slip it and release it. The clutch is basically a controlled explosion of friction material that transfers thousands of horsepower to the wheels in a fraction of a second. Get it wrong, and the car either bogs down or lights the tires up. Most teams managed the clutch by feel. The crew chief would adjust the clutch pack between runs based on how the car looked on the previous pass. If it wheel spin, tighten the clutch. If it bogged, loosen it. Simple. Muldowney developed a more systematic approach. She worked with her crew to create detailed logs of clutch settings, track conditions, weather data, and elapsed times. Over hundreds of runs, she built up a database that allowed her to predict optimal clutch settings before the car ever left the starting line. Other teams saw her consistency and assumed she was just lucky. She was not lucky. She was prepared. This same approach applied to her Hemi modifications. Every engine failure was documented, the broken parts were analyzed, the failure modes were categorized, and slowly, over years of accumulated knowledge, she developed an understanding of the 426 Hemi that bordered on intimate. The hemispherical combustion chamber design that gave the Hemi its name was both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The shape allowed for efficient flame propagation and large valves, which meant excellent breathing and high power output. But it also created stress concentrations in the head casting that could lead to cracks under racing conditions. Muldowney identified the specific areas where these cracks typically originated and worked with foundries to develop heads with reinforced webbing in those locations. She also pioneered the use of specific torque sequences and gasket materials that reduced the stress on the head castings. These modifications extended head life by roughly 40%, which meant fewer failures and more consistent performance. The connecting rod work was similarly detailed. Standard racing practice at the time was to simply buy the strongest rods available and hope they held together. Muldowney analyzed rod failures and discovered that most of them occurred not because of overall rod strength, but because of stress risers at the beam-to-cap junction. She worked with rod manufacturers to develop specific radius specifications and surface finishes that eliminated these stress risers. The result was a rod that was actually lighter than the heavy-duty alternatives, but more reliable. And the crankshaft counterweight optimization I mentioned earlier was perhaps her most significant contribution. The conventional wisdom in drag racing was that lighter was better. Lighter rotating assembly meant faster acceleration. Simple physics. But Muldowney realized that simple physics didn't account for tire behavior. A nitro-burning Top Fuel engine doesn't deliver power smoothly. It delivers power in massive pulses, 8 per revolution, each one capable of breaking the tires loose. A lighter crankshaft amplified these pulses. A heavier crankshaft smoothed them out. The net result was counterintuitive, but undeniable. Her slightly heavier engine put more power to the ground because it spent less time spinning the tires. The trap speeds were lower, but the elapsed times were faster. That's what mattered. By the mid-1980s, virtually every competitive Top Fuel team had adopted some version of Muldowney's crankshaft approach. Few of them credited her, but she knew. And what of Shirley Muldowney today? She retired from professional racing in 2003 at the age of 63. 63 years old, still strapping into a machine that could kill her, still competing against drivers who weren't born when she won her first championship. Her career spanned nearly 4 decades, 3 championships, 18 national event wins, and more importantly, a complete transformation of how drag racing teams approached engine development. She was inducted into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 1990, the Automotive Hall of Fame in 2007. Her life story was made into a movie, Heart Like a Wheel, in 1983, with Bonnie Bedelia playing her. Not bad for a kid from Schenectady who just wanted to go fast. The 426 Hemi is still raced today. The basic architecture that Chrysler designed in the 1960s remains the foundation of most Top Fuel and funny car engines, though modern versions bear little resemblance to the original. But many of the fundamental modifications that make those engines reliable, the valve guide materials, the connecting rod specifications, the crankshaft counterweight philosophy, can be traced directly back to Shirley Muldowney's work. She proved something important, not just that a woman could compete in drag racing, that was the headline, and it mattered, but it wasn't the whole story. She proved that smart engineering could overcome any obstacle. She proved that understanding why something works is more valuable than just knowing that it works, and she proved that the people who tell you something is impossible are usually the people most afraid of being proven wrong. And that is the story of Shirley Muldowney and the 426 Hemi. Subscribe if you want more, and let me know in the comments, had you heard of her before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.